I'll stop it there. You get the sense. So the point of this is to talk about the sort of deification of Washington, and what we're going to talk about the Revolutionary Army and the way in which the Revolution changes people's idea about citizenship and about nationalism and things like that. But the sort of takeaway from this lecture is in part that Washington and the army become the nation in the eyes of many people, and this is important for understanding kind of the emergence of nationalism in this period. I want to talk about militias and the regular army. I want to talk about irregular warfare. I want to talk about the retreat from New York and the making of nationalism. We'll start with sort of Enlightenment ideas about kind of truth and again, I don't have my lecture. So, okay. This is a period in which religious traditions are in part being reshaped, questioning of established religions, and this in the 1700s. This has a lot to do with the previous 200 years or 150 years, where tensions between various Christian religions helps to sort of destabilize and lead to questioning of what constitutes revealed religion. This is from the French Encyclopedia in 1772, and what's going on in this picture? It says truth. And what do we see here? What's going on? 224679 for those of people who are on Twitch. What is truth, and what are some of the ideals of the Enlightenment that we see taking place in this picture? We associate the Enlightenment with the 1750s forward, generally in Europe and the United States. What's going on? I'll zoom in. Who are these people here at the bottom? And what do they have to do with truth? Two, 224-679 is the Slido number. Children. Yeah, they're young women. These are, they look a little bit like children. They're sort of at the feet of this person. What are they holding? What do they represent? First of all, what do we see? What are some of the these young women doing in this picture? What are they holding? What are they looking at? Knowledge. Okay, good. And musical instruments and charts. So we've got, this is, you probably remember from trigonometry, the sort of relationship between angles that gives us sine and cosine. They're holding books and scrolls and mathematical tools. Excellent. They all seem to be looking up at one girl, admiring her right, and she is truth. They're holding various inventions, musical instruments, and objects of cultural significance. Right, excellent. So these are the Muses, right? The ancient Muses. And so the Muses are, so if you look over here on the right, this woman bending down and writing, she's Clio, C-L-I-O. and she's the muse of history. I'm going to forget the other names, but these are basically the arts. This is Franklin College, right? This is Franklin College. This is the various divisions of Franklin College, and they're part of what a university is about, is history, mathematics, engineering, music, theater, literature, wine. There is not a department of wine in Franklin College, but one of the muses is associated with what's the word? Agronomy, so agricultural science and ecology. This is, and then there's someone else holding a Bible. These muses are, in part in the 1700s, they're what we call the Enlightenment. Is part of it is drawing back on traditions that go all the way back to the ancient Greek and Roman past, and the confidence in the kind of power of intellect to create and define and resolve truth. Okay. There are some men here on the side offering gifts, but they can't offer the gift of the sciences. They can only offer the gift of manufacturing, and they're the sort of engineers. This is the STEM side of the equation, right? And on the left is the kind of humanities, social sciences, and sciences. Okay. So the Revolutionary War is a war that Britain, it starts initially with the protests over taxes. The battle at Lexington and Concord helps sort of propel this into a fighting conflict. And what Britain does is it's already accumulated a massive debt for fighting the French and Indian War, and before that, the War of Austrian Secession. As we said before, their debts are massive, and so they're not going to raise an army to put the British down, and so they hire mercenaries called the Hessians, and these are mostly Fusiliers. So these are German soldiers. There are also, of course, English soldiers who are brought in, and the U.S., the colonies, as they come together to fight this war with Great Britain, have basically two kinds of soldiers. They have, first of all, the army, and there's about perhaps 10,000 soldiers at any one time in the American Army. Very small force, led by George Washington, and with the familiar chain of command of officers all the way down to privates. These are regular soldiers recruited to fight in the army. The problem is, as we saw in the chapter this week, that paying them is a complicated problem, and it becomes very difficult to continually pay soldiers to fight this conflict because the Continental Congress doesn't have a taxing power, as a couple of you said. Someone asked what were the missionaries again, and those aren't the missionaries, those are the Muses. I think that's the question. Okay.
Mercenaries?
Oh, mercenaries. Okay, not missionaries. Mercenaries. So sorry, mercenaries is the word, and so thank you. The mercenaries are people who are hired basically to fight on your behalf, and so the British hire mercenaries, these mostly Prussian mercenaries from Prussia, who are brought over to fight, and then they're paid by the... Prussia is Germany now, what we now call the center of Germany. Thank you. All right, but that's not everything that's in the army. There are about, depending on the period, about 40 or 50,000 other people, never all at one time, that are in the militias. And this is an image from 1830, looking back 30 years to around the time of the Revolution. And militias were crowds, right? We talked about crowds last time, and this is what a militia is. It's very disorganized. People drilled on Militia Day, which was usually once a month. Men would come, sometimes with muskets, sometimes with pitchforks. They would walk around on a field and fight. These militias were important in fighting the war, but George Washington did not think much of them. They, in fact, had there were some important battles that militias were involved in, and Washington's feeling about the militias was that they could show up. They could. Some of them were quite good at fighting, but they'd often disperse once a battle was over, believing that they had won the war if they had won a particular battle. The American forces don't generally win a lot of battles. And so what we see is, and these are people who don't know the commands for advance or retreat, which are usually a combination of a fife and drum that tell you when to advance, when to retreat, when to hold your position, those sorts of things that make it possible to have an army in the field. These are people that would hide behind trees and shoot. They often did not obey the traditional rules of war that both the Washington's army and the British army, their rules. So, for example, some militias would have one or two sharpshooters that they would put up in trees, and they would look for the officers and kill them. This was not considered acceptable or kosher behavior, but it was actually extremely useful. David Claypool Johnston is the person who drew this picture in 1830. Someone asked about this, and this is his drawing of. So at this point in 1830, Johnston himself is 40 or so years old. He's familiar with the militias of the old days. Okay. The British army tended to march in formation. And as I said before in Lexington and Concord, when lined up against American forces, either American soldiers or American militias, British soldiers tended to do better. But a lot of conflicts throughout this revolution were not individual battles. They tended to be armies moving from one place to another, British armies moving from one place to another, often being sniped by American forces throughout. What George Washington did do is bring in other German officers to train his troops, and this gave the American forces under Washington, again, a relatively small force, much more. They made them much better soldiers. One advantage that the militias and the army had were long rifles. It was technically illegal to have a forge in the American colonies, but there were illegal forges. There were silversmiths and iron workers. There were people who worked in iron to produce weapons. And the Pennsylvania long rifle, which was manufactured, this is incredibly expensive. This was something like this was more expensive than a house. But it did have a rifled bore, which meant that traditional muskets that a fusilier would have, go back here. So the fusiliers tended to have muskets like this. But the long rifle could shoot over 100 yards with considerable accuracy. And in the hands of someone who knew how to fire, climbing up into a tree, looking for an officer, and taking out an officer, this was tremendously important in helping to defeat the ranks of the British Army. I don't have my lecture here, so I'm winging this a little bit. Okay, so what Washington is especially good at, and this was true in Pittsburgh and elsewhere, is retreating gracefully. And that's largely what this war is about, is keeping his force together, but being continuously on the retreat. And so the retreat from New York puts him increasingly in rural places. This is important because the way in which the British thought about this conflict was that all they needed to do was take the major cities, and they would deprive the army of their food, that they would deprive their army of their capacity to support themselves. What they don't really understand is that the American colonies have been provisioning the Caribbean colonies for over a century, and so finding provisions is actually much easier than you would expect in the American countryside, and it's American officers that are able to provision themselves in relatively rural areas. So the British take New York City, the British take Philadelphia, the British take Boston, the British take Charleston. But it doesn't matter. The army is still around and is still threatening the British forces. Crossing the Delaware is a famous, it's a kind of famous image, and in it, basically, Washington retreats across the Delaware and then comes back at night to attack British forces. And it's this kind of guerrilla conflict. It's conflict at night was not supposed to be acceptable behavior in soldiers, but this kind of guerrilla activity is crucial for Washington's success. The suffering at Valley Forge is made worse by the situation of the Continental Congress, which is incapable of providing rations or pay for soldiers, and there's Washington is sending people out to requisition supplies from rural regions, but the kind of organization, the logistics, basically what you see throughout this conflict is Washington and his men living off the land. They're not relying on traditional lines of supply. And this is very confusing and confounding to the British troops, which are used to occupying cities and expecting surrender. Oh, sorry. Did I say Washington brought in British officers? No, he brought in German officers to train his troops. So Prussian officers also. So there were, at this point, Germany doesn't exist. It's a whole bunch of different principalities. Many of the British troops are coming from a place called Hesse in Germany, in Prussia. And there are other parts of Germany or other German-speaking officers that are brought in to help the Americans. All right, so yes, the retreat from New York. The British capture Philadelphia in 1777, which again, because the Continental Congress was there, they assumed that was it, that the war was over. But in fact, the Continental Congress just moved repeatedly throughout this conflict. A way to get a sense of what the Army is doing, the American Army is doing, is to think about this person, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. He's a British officer. He raids down the Hudson River corridor, and his idea is to separate New York, which is somewhat wealthier, from New England, and to do that, basically take control of the Hudson River Valley. It takes him, though, much longer to get in place in Montreal, almost 6 months longer to get to get from Montreal to Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga is the kind of highest point along the Hudson River. The U.S. or sort of American forces are invested there. There's about 3,000 of them. Burgoyne's forces are 7,000. And after identifying where the British are, the Americans basically abandoned Fort Ticonderoga. The one advantage, and one of the key advantages that Washington has, is a tremendously important spy network inside the British Army. So he has spies who are themselves British officers who are paid by the Americans to provide intelligence. He also has a network of spies who are available to kind of provide him information about where people are going. So Burgoyne captures Fort Ticonderoga, and this is the capture of Fort Ticonderoga is probably the lowest point in the American Revolution. At this point, both Britain, King George III rushes in to his wife, who's partially dressed, and said, "We've defeated the Americans, right? We've captured Fort Ticonderoga. The U.S. soldiers had abandoned it, but we now have the Hudson River. We've won, right?" But they hadn't won. In fact, as Burgoyne himself, tremendously confident, a kind of self-styled poet and philosopher, it doesn't realize that in capturing Fort Ticonderoga, his army is now fully in danger because he's surrounded by these American forces who are hiding in the woods. They march down to Kingston in October of 1777. Kingston is then the capital of New York, and they burn it to the ground. But shortly after this group of now 6,500, 6,000 or so soldiers are surrounded and forced to surrender at Saratoga on October 7th. The South is even more chaotic. What we see are British forces trying to arm enslaved people. They promise that enslaved people who cross the lines, enslaved men who cross the lines into British cities, British-controlled cities, will be given their freedom if they fight against the United States. The number of these soldiers is relatively small, perhaps under 1,000, but it's as you can imagine, terribly disturbing to many of the enslavers in the South, and some of the people who had been on the fence about support for the revolution, when they see I don't have my notes. What's the Lord Dunmore's proclamation declaring that enslaved people who cross over the line and support Britain, when they see Lord Dunmore's proclamation, many of these enslavers side with the revolution. So Georgia, and in particular Georgia and South Carolina, which had been wavering about the revolution, Virginia had been strongly in favor of it. Georgia and South Carolina, what you see is slaveholders switching over to the side of the revolution after Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Now there are enslaved people who fight on the Union side, on the side of the American Revolution as well, but it's a much smaller group of people.
You have a question about POWs.
POWs. Oh, how did the Americans treat British POWs and vice versa? That's a great question. So American POWs were put on ships in the harbor in New York, and they died in large quantities, large numbers. The idea of the kind of the laws of war from the Middle Ages, but really as they're kind of made concrete around the 1700s, the expectation is that privates would be exchanged for privates, corporals for corporals, generals for generals, that sort of thing, a little bit like chess pieces. And so soldiers were, to a certain extent, valuable, right? Because freeing or exchanging privates for privates would get you soldiers back. And this idea of exchange of people was supposed to help prevent large-scale casualties. But the British did not treat the American POWs especially well, and keeping them on ships, a very large number of them died. New prisoners of war who were brought onto these ships were called fresh fish, and this is an expression that's still used in prisoner of war camps all the way up to the Vietnam War and afterwards, that new prisoners would be called fresh fish in reference to this situation. POW is prisoner of war. People didn't use the term POW in the 1770s, but they did use the term prisoner of war. And so that was what that question was, prisoners of war. British prisoners of war, it was much harder for an army on the move the American army on the move to exchange prisoners, but that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure what happened. I mean, I know that British officers were kept and traded for American officers, but I don't quite know what happens to British soldiers that are captured by the Americans. They weren't slaughtered wholesale, I don't think, because this doesn't show up in British accounts of this war. They see the Americans as being violent and kind of, what's the word, irresponsible, not because of the way they treat prisoners, but because of the way they treat officers. I think the other thing is the fact that you're retreating most of the time means that you're much less likely to get prisoners, right? If you capture and invest an area and take control of it, then you capture prisoners and things like that. You're less likely, if you're just constantly running away from the enemy, to be in a position where you're going to capture prisoners. Okay. It's Washington's initial plan was to try to capture New York. I mean, after Saratoga was a victory after Ticonderoga, but sorry, let me go back for a second. The victory, so the American forces lose at Ticonderoga, but the American forces win shortly after that at Saratoga. Once Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne's troops are surrounded and captured, oh right, those are prisoners of war. Those people are traded for American soldiers, and it's at this point that the French decide to side with the United States, the American colonies, against the British. The French and the Spanish had thought of the American colonial revolt as being just a sideshow, that they could never win against the British. But the capture of Johnny Burgoyne's soldiers at Saratoga leads the French to support the Americans against Great Britain. And this is crucial to understanding the next step, which is Yorktown. So initially, Washington has plans to take either Boston or New York or Philadelphia, but he discovers that the British troops are retreating. Cornwallis's men are retreating from the south, where they've been harried by Southern troops, all the way to this place at Yorktown on the peninsula. They're being chased at this point by, let's see, where are they? It's when they get to the peninsula that they are chased by French soldiers under General Rochambeau. American soldiers are also with them. This is partly because he's got some sick soldiers, partly because he needs to get supply, and so he's confident that he'll be able to supply himself at Yorktown. Because if you see, Yorktown is along the York River, that little peninsula that sticks out, and the expectation is that he can get supply from the York River. What Rochambeau doesn't take into account is the French Navy, and the French Navy blockades Yorktown, and this allows a victory for the Americans, which is crucial, and really the crucial and ending conflict in the war. This would be easier to do if I had kept my notes. So the Siege of Yorktown is mostly British and some French soldiers. Washington, although he has French support from Rochambeau, very much wants it to be Americans that capture Yorktown. In placing sentries, there's a legend that Washington said, "Let none but Americans keep watch tonight." He believes, he worries about his French allies, who have only been his allies for a year and a half. By this point, remember that Washington had been fighting the French in the French and Indian War. And so while he's very friendly with Rochambeau, he's uncomfortable and concerned about this support of the French. It's at this point that, oh my goodness, I wish I had my notes here, but I don't. What's the officer? Is it Cornwallis? Oh, it's Cornwallis, of course. General Cornwallis realizes that he's surrounded. And he, at this point, rather than actually going out with a flag of surrender and surrendering, Cornwallis claims to be ill. He stays in his tent, and he sends out a junior officer to surrender the British troops. This surrender is basically the end of the war. It's at this point that the British decide to settle by 1783. Sorry, 1781. What's at stake here? What's the issue? Well, the central issue, the primary issue, is the cost of this war, right? So British debt, national debt, had gone up from 1750, as you can see, to from about 80 million pounds to 120 million pounds at the end of the 7 Years' War. They started to pay it down a little bit, but then the American War costs a great deal more, and the British public debt goes from 130 million, roughly, to 240 million. And these costs, these tremendous costs, lead to tremendous conflict in Parliament, where the West India interest says, let them go. We still have the West Indian colonies. We still have the Caribbean colonies. Those are the colonies that are paying for us. The American colonies may be valuable 50 years from now, 100 years from now, but it's not worth continuing to fight. And so this is the part of the reason that the Caribbean colonies, which were the most valuable colonies in the New World for Britain, never become part of the United States, because that is something that the British government will never give up. Those colonies with enslaved people producing sugar, coffee, even tobacco in Jamaica, those places are the most valuable. Let me just see. When did the French join the Americans? Yeah, they get there in 79. Thank you. It's after Saratoga that they decide to. It's 77 that they decide to, October 7th to 70, or shortly after the Saratoga, that they decide to support them. But it's not until, thank you, it's not until 79 that those forces arrive. How did they, okay. That's right. So so the Declaration of Independence is just a kind of, it's itself, in 1776, is a declaration that the U.S. is independent. But the war that comes after that is really what this is about. If the Britain had won this war, the Declaration of Independence wouldn't be remembered. We only remember it now because of the victory at Yorktown. And this is truly the end of the American Revolution. Thank you for that question. So what happens with the army? What's important about the army is, of course, the battles. Of course, the fact that Washington is able to harry British forces that really can't understand this guerrilla conflict. The British forces can't manage to surround and capture enough of the American army to declare victory. Washington's men are constantly on the run, and the fact that they're never full, there's never more than a few regiments that are captured by the British is really important for sustaining the revolution. This is very much like other guerrilla conflicts in the 20th century. This is like the conflict in China against Japan in 1945, led by Mao Zedong. This is very similar to the North Vietnamese fighting against the South Vietnamese. these guerrilla fighters are kind of uncatchable or very, very difficult to catch. So how is it that people remember the war? They remember the war through these prints like this, which are very hard to read now. But I'd like to kind of go through them. It's at this point Lord North's ministry in the UK. He's forced to step down in March of 1782, and 1783 is the final signature of the peace treaty. What's similar about Washington, and the reason he's a kind of hero, and the reason the army is so important for understanding Washington, is that just like Mao, it's the army that's traveling around in retreat from imperial forces. First, Mao's army, in what's called the Long March, is escaping effectively from, first of all, the Japanese, who have invaded and invested China, but then the nationalists, who are, Mao himself is a communist. The nationalists, it's complicated, but the nationalists have the support of what's now Soviet Russia, and they're trying to crush the Chinese Communist Party. And what Mao does is basically escape and escape and escape. But the traveling to all of these places make for a kind of, lead to a kind of apotheosis, or a kind of rising to greatness of, or a kind of godlike status to the central general. Just like Mao, if you go around China now, you'll see places that say Mao slept here, or the Red Army slept here. It's the same thing with George Washington, right? George Washington, the various places that he and Rochambeau stopped are historic markers all over the United States. And the kind of legend of Washington, the legend of his soldiers, become what stitch the nation together. As religious ideas are crumbling in some ways as a result of these battles between Protestants and Catholics and others, we see a kind of new sort of Enlightenment nationalism. But the Enlightenment traditionally is associated with highly literate people. What we see with the American army is the army itself is the kind of agent of nationalism, the agent of these sort of new principles of what become the United States. So what we get are legends about the war. And so you can see here, it says, so this is Aesopus, which is the other name for Kingston, which had been the New York capital. And what does he say? Oh, horrid, is this the marriage ceremony? These are supposedly native people scalping and attacking Americans. This is, you see the Cedars, and this Cedars is a story about native people who had been on the side of the British, who captured and supposedly tortured American prisoners. And this cartoon, which shows Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, he's carrying the scale of talents. He's carrying with him a couple of the plays that he's written before he arrived here, and he declares, "I've bled my ragamuffins where they've been peppered." Below is the Scottish soldiers who are defeated in a battle, and what this cartoon is making fun of is the fact that the Scottish soldiers, of course, wear kilts and are somehow womanly. So hoot away, lads, can ye not? Arnold is at your heels. This is Benedict Arnold. This is, of course, when Benedict Arnold was on the side of the Americans before he became a traitor. And how hard, O Fraser, is thy lot. Was it for this I sought the court and danced. This sort of ideal of American manliness that you saw in the cartoon that I started with is an important kind of binding force in the American Revolution. And here you can see the devil speaking to the British court, King George, and his cabinet, with instructions to how Bergoyne, etc., that says, though nature's Germans tumble all together, even till destruction sicken. By the 1780s, the middle and latter part of the 1780s, we start to see tension inside Washington's cabinet. Sorry, let me step back. One of the things that's different about Washington from Mao or from other revolutionary generals of the 20th century is that Washington gives up power after he takes it in the revolution. That Washington is initially made president, but then commits to stepping down in 1800 when after having served 2 terms. And this is very different from Mao. This is very different from Trotsky, who built a revolution in Russia in the same way that that Washington did. This is very different from Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, who continue to hold power. So sort of political power never goes away. Okay. The way in which soldiers are paid after this war is with land in the West. And this is an image from 1818 that captures, I think, or is designed to capture what the state of the United States after the successful revolution against the British. You can see the rifle above the wall turned upside down, suggesting that it won't be fired again until it's needed. The soldier leaning against the fire with George Washington's portrait over his head. People dancing in slippers. These slippers are suggested. This is supposed to be in Pittsburgh, but you're supposed to be struck by the fact that these are farmers who are sort of celebrating the victory and are quite wealthy and well off because they have dancing slippers and they can go to a tavern and drink. Okay. So the national character of the Army itself becomes a crucial legend. It's Parson Weems, W-E-E-M-S, who creates all the legends of Washington that you've probably heard of. That he chopped down the cherry tree, that he said he could not tell a lie, all these things that aren't true. Parson Weems creates and knits together the story of American, the kind of American nationalism, which is a kind of blend of Enlightenment traditions and this sort of mob tradition. The militias who briefly fight in this war, sometimes only for a few months, sometimes for perhaps a year. These militias increasingly spread this idea of American national traditions. As they move from place to place throughout the Revolution, they stitch the nation together in a sense, and the kind of memory of that revolution is what helps to kind of bind the nation together. Unlike, as I said, Mao, Washington steps down from power. Okay. We will now get to the Constitution on Friday. We will by then have finally caught up to the readings. I'm still doing the I'm having a little bit of trouble getting the Slido information into a format that I can that allows me to just do a sort of attendance. And if you're here 2/3 to 3/4 of the time, that's an A for me. I understand that people have issues. They can't show up to all the classes. Can't necessarily even show up to the lectures on Twitch. But yeah, so those will be posted very soon. And the plan at this point is to return, to have the things graded by Monday. You'll have that more soon. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, I got it.
9 things I'm supposed to bring. And the one thing I don't bring is the letter. No, thank you.
Oh, I do, yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. No, that was great. That was great.
I don't feel...
No, you shouldn't.
I just, having used the word Prussian so many times in my life, it's like blank stare.